Yone is going to be buffed for this patch. We've got nerfs to many of the OP champs from 25.6, and Yorick is receiving massive changes to every single ability besides his W. So as always, we're here to break it all down for you guys and provide you with a complete update to the solo queue tier list for every single role. Now let's be honest, picking the best champions is fun, but is that really enough on its own? I don't know about you, but locking in Kayle just because she's OP tier doesn't really help if you're getting run down in lane. However, you can stomp lane phase even as Kayle when using our brand new courses that go hard in teaching you everything you need to know, which will have you speedrunning any game below Diamond, all from a rank 1 challenger who has used these tips to dominate not 1 but 5 regions in solo queue, and that's just for top lane. Your mid lane OP tier Ahri pick from this tier list becomes actually unstoppable when you know all the essentials of mid lane thanks to the new mid lane series over on our platform that our top 10 challenger player Strompist has tirelessly worked on exclusive to our members. Our tier list gets you the right champions, SkillCapped gets you the right skills, and we're so confident it works. If you don't climb 5 divisions while actively using the platform, you literally don't pay a single cent. So why hold yourself back this season and finally get the rank you deserve? And with that being said, let's get into it. So to kick off the video, let's break down the item changes for this patch, as we've only got 2 of them. Catalyst is getting buffed in a pretty big way, as its build path being changed with an extra ruby crystal being added. This means in instances where you take a recall and you have a little bit less than 1300 gold, you won't have to sit on around 600 gold and walk back to lane, and instead we'll be able to pick up an added ruby crystal. The mana that you get from Catalyst is going up as well, from 300 to 375 gold, while the passive mana restore from damage taken is up from 7 to 10%. If you guys watched our OP builds video from last patch, then you'd know of the strategy that Froggen has been using on his tier list Anivia, where he rushes Catalyst, never upgrades it to Rod of Ages, while going into Malignance and Shirelias as his 2 core items. That strategy becomes even better now due to these Catalyst buffs, so we'll have to see if it catches on more this patch. Rod of Ages users in general will become stronger for 25.7, so we're looking at Ryze, Anivia, Twisted Fate, Kassadin, Cassiopeia, Veigar, Ahri, and Volibear to see a small spike in power. Umbral Glaive has finally fallen out of meta on the majority of champions, so Riot's got a few changes planned for 25.7. The cost of Umbral is going down from 2600 to 2500 gold, while the AD is up from 50 to 55. The compensation nerf is to the passive cooldown being increased from 50 to 90 seconds. We're definitely leaning towards this being a net buff to Umbral Glaive because more damage in exchange for less vision control has been proven this season to be a positive change. As we saw at the very start of the season, Riot removed Eyeball Collection from the Domination tree and replaced it with vision-oriented runes, and that resulted in all Domination primary users losing win rate. So we expect for Pyke to gain the most amount of power from this adjustment, as he was the only champion in 25.6 running Umbral Glaive at a significant rate. Pantheon support is one other that did have a decent play rate with Umbral Glaive, so he'll benefit too. Other than that though, no other champions in the game had a significant play rate with Umbral Glaive, so whether or not that changes for this patch is hard to say. We'll have to see how impactful these changes land when they hit live servers, but if there were to be more champs to pick up the item, it would most likely be Senna and certain lethality junglers who would like it the most. You're not going to be able to get back to lane quite as fast for 25.7 after coming off a recall. This is because health regen per second when you're in Fountain is going down from 10.4 to 8% max health. Max mana per second is also dropping from 12.4 to 10%. Missing health and mana per second is going up from 6 scaling to 12% to 16% at all ranks. And then Home Guard's decaying movement speed is dropping from 75 to 65% in the early game. And then we have one more minor change to lane swap detection, to where the detection radius will no longer include the Raptor camp. So this patch is jam-packed with top lane changes, and first up is Olaf. We have a change to Olaf's E, to where the cast time is being lowered from 0.25 seconds to 0.25 scaling to 0.175 seconds based on Olaf's attack speed. What you want to pay attention to in these comparison clips is the damage per second. With this change implemented and on your 1 item spike of Stridebreaker, damage per second with 2 autos, an E, and another 2 autos is at 342. Last patch though, with that exact same combo, damage per second was at 304. So even though this change isn't a direct boost in Olaf's damage, it will allow for you to start auto-attacking faster after using the spell, which will lead to higher damage per second. Let's say for example, you're fighting the enemy and right after you use E on them, they flash away with less than 50 health. Well, with this buff implemented, you may now be able to get that auto-attack off after E usage and actually land the killing blow. Olaf has been teetering around an A and S tier position for a while now, so with this buff coming through, it should lock him down as a solid S tier pick for 25.7. There was a time that Trundle dominated the top lane meta last season, however, he's been in a rather average spot for a while now. To help him out, Riot will be buffing Trundle's E as the cooldown drops from 24 to 21 seconds at rank 1, while E slow is up from 30 scaling to 46% to 34 scaling to 50%. Considering Trundle's E isn't the spell you max out when playing him in the top lane, 3 seconds seconds off the cooldown at rank 1 in the spell is really nice. We don't see these buffs being enough to really propel Trundle into a top tier spot, but he'll be a more than viable A tier pick for 25.7. It feels like these damage to tower buffs for top laners have been issued a ton over the past year, and another top laner who's up next is Shen. Shen's Q base damage will now be applying to turrets, so as we can see in the comparison clips there, you get 19 extra damage per auto attack. So definitely a useful buff for Shen, especially with him being a champion who wants to play in the side lane to draw pressure and then use his R to enter fights. There's a chance this buff pushes Shen up into S tier territory, but we're leaning more towards it being not quite enough, so we'll be leaving him in the A tier for now. AD Volibear stocks are on the rise for this patch, as his empowered W damage is now going to scale off 15% of his bonus AD. So the fact it's a bonus AD ratio and not a total AD ratio does make it a bit underwhelming, but as we can see here, it ends up being around an 8 damage increase when you have Sundered Sky completed. So especially with Catalyst getting buffed for this patch and Rod of Ages becoming even better on Volley, we probably don't see this buff outweighing that, and AP hybrid Volley builds are likely to continue to outperform. As a result, we won't be moving Volibear up the top lane tier list. So with Darius getting nerfed in the jungle last patch, it turns out Riot wants his power coming down in the top lane as well, so they'll be nerfing him again in 25.7. Base armor is dropping from 39 to 37, while E cooldown takes a hit, being increased from 24 scaling to 14 seconds to 26 scaling to 16 seconds. Nerfs hit Darius in the jungle and top lane, and both roles will be moved down the tier list for 25.7, as we're dropping Darius from S into A tier. So it turns out Riot really overshot with the Gwen changes last patch, and they'll be issuing more follow-up nerfs for 25.7. Gwen was already hotfix nerfed at the start of 25.6, and we feel like Riot may be going back a bit too far with these nerfs. Q damage buff from last patch is being completely reverted, so dropping by 10 at all ranks. W is going to have its base resists lowered from 25 to 22, while the AP ratio on W resists is up from 5 to 7%. So all in all, definitely net nerfs to Gwen, and she'll be dropping out of the OP tier and down into S. Singed is being changed for a second patch in a row, as he's ended up as a really strong low elo top laner now after his Q change from last patch. So passive per target cooldown is going up from 8 to 10 seconds. Q AP ratio per second is being increased from 40% to 42.5%, and R is getting nerfed with the stats being lowered from 30 scaling to 100 to 25 scaling to 95. So whether these adjustments land net positive or negative is hard to say. Whichever way they do sway though, we don't think it will be all that significant, so for now, we'll be leaving Singed in the top lane S tier. These Yorick changes are absolutely massive, as his passive Q, E, and R are all being adjusted. First, for the passive changes, the number of enemy deaths needed to spawn a grave is dropping from 12 to 8 in the early game. Mistwalker health is being reduced, as we can see here in 25.6, they have 292 health, while in 25.7, they are lower at 122. There is a buff though to compensate for this, as you will no longer be able to one-shot Mistwalkers with autos or single target spells. Instead of taking 50% less damage to all monsters, Mistwalkers will now take 60% less damage from minions and non-epic monsters. Mistwalker's base AD is going up, however, its total AD ratio is being swapped for a bonus AD ratio. You'll also notice that the Mistwalkers are attacking a lot slower in 25.7, as instead of gaining 8% attack speed per level, they will gain attack speed based on Yorick's bonus attack speed. Mistwalkers will no longer recall with Yorick if they are hitting a jungle camp, so this is a nice buff to jungle Yorick. A buff that will help out both top lane and jungle Yorick is to his Q, as it will now spawn a grave when you hit a champion and large or epic monsters. Q cooldown is also dropping by 1 second at rank 1 in the spell. Q damage is going up as the total AD ratio is being increased from 40 to 50%. E damage is taking a significant hit though, as it's being changed from dealing damage equal to 15% of the target's current health to now having a base value of 70 scaling to 210. AP ratio on E is going up from 70 to 100%. You're going to be getting more movement speed when hitting E, as it's up from 20 to 30%. E is also being changed so that instead of providing Mistwalkers with 20% added damage for 8 attacks, E will now provide Yorick with 18 scaling to 30% armor shred on hit. E leap and basic attacks will now apply Black Cleaver stacks properly, and E will no longer fail to reach its targets over terrain. R is being adjusted so that the base value is up from 0 scaling to 40 to 50 scaling to 100. However, the 50% total AD ratio is being swapped for a 30% bonus AD ratio. And as we can see in the comparison clips, on your Trinity Force completion, Yorick R is dealing 40 damage per hit in 25.7, while it was only dealing 27 damage per hit in 25.6. The R change is a nice damage boost throughout the early to mid game and only turns into a nerf much later on. So what we can take away from all these changes is that Yorick's early game will be getting stronger. Late game, he may end up a bit weaker though, so what we likely will see as a result of these changes is Yorick skewing a bit more to the higher elos now and less so to the lower ranks. Yorick has always been known as that low elo stomper, but with these adjustments, there's a chance that's not the case anymore. It's anyone's guess as to exactly how much win rate Yorick gains or loses from these adjustments. So for the time being, we'll be leaving him in the top lane A tier, and we'll definitely circle back for mid-patch if the changes do end up swaying significantly in one way or the other. So here's how we have the top lane tier list aligned for 25.7, as Gwen dropping out of the OP tier now leaves Urgot and Kayle as the two leading the way. Even though there were a ton of champs changed for top lane this patch, many of the changes were pretty light, so there isn't a ton of movement on the tier list. If anything, champs like Darius and Gwen becoming weaker just provides even more indirect strength for Urgot as that incredibly powerful early game top laner. Cassio Top has been very consistently the highest win rate top laner in solo queue this season, and with the catalyst buffs coming through for this patch, it makes her even more scary. If you're someone who likes playing those strong off-meta picks, then Cass Top is without question the best for 25.7. Brand Jungle has fallen completely out of meta recently, so we have 2 buffs to boost his clear speed. Passive damage cap to non-epic monsters is going up from 30 to 40, and passive explosion damage cap to monsters is being increased from 250 scaling to 475 to 270 scaling to 525. So with these buffs, Brand should go back to being a viable jungler for 25.7, so we're moving him from C into B tier. Ivern will have his Q buffed for this patch as the root duration is being increased from 1.2 to 1.6 seconds. Will this buff actually be enough to propel Ivern from A into S tier though? Probably not, so we'll be leaving him in A for now, and if the buff does land more impactful than expected, we will adjust him up for mid-patch. AD Shaco will become stronger for 25.7 as his passive bonus AD ratio is being increased from 25 to 30%, while Q bonus AD ratio is up from 60 to 65%. Nothing too crazy here for Shaco, but he has been very close to an A tier spot in recent patches, so we'll be giving him the bump from B into A tier. Riot's going back on the Lilia buff from last patch, as they'll be reducing her E AP ratio from 60 to 50%. The Lilia buffs from last patch actually did end up making her extremely powerful, so with this nerf on the way, we'll be dropping her from OP into S tier. So the hot topic from 25.6 was Naafiri becoming the most OP jungler, and as a result, she will be getting nerfed with her armor dropping from 30 to 28, and health is down from 635 to 610. W cooldown will be 2 seconds longer in the early game, and mid-game going from 20 scaling to 18 seconds to 22 scaling to 18 seconds. Passive bonus damage to monsters will be reduced from 165 to 155%, and then Q damage to minions is going up from 80 to 100%. So all things considered, these look like pretty light nerfs when you take into account how powerful Naafiri has been. Naafiri has held upwards of a 53.5% win rate in 25.6, and these nerfs only look like they will be enough to drop that by 3% at max. We're leaning more towards the nerfs being in the 1 to 2% range though, and in that case, we really don't see Naafiri losing her top tier spot in meta. So for now, we are going to be leaving Naafiri in the jungle OP tier, but if the nerfs do end up landing on the harsher side, then we could adjust her into S tier for the mid-patch tier list. Regardless of how the nerfs land though, we can't see them completely removing the champ from meta, so no reason to drop Naafiri for 25.7. So for the jungle tier list in 25.7, with both Gwen and Lilia dropping out of the OP tier, we'll be moving Jarvan back up alongside Naafiri. Darius is going to be dropping down into the A tier for this patch, as the nerfs we've already covered when looking at top lane will negatively influence his power as a jungler. We've seen so many off-meta picks suddenly make their way into meta over the past couple of patches, and we've got another one on the rise in the jungle right now, being Dr. Mundo. Mundo has been seeing a steady play rate increase over the past few patches, and has actually been performing exceptionally well too. Mundo did just receive a base health buff in 25.5, so that definitely helped him out. To be fair though, if we go back even a few patches before then, Mundo jungle was hovering right around a 50% win rate, so he's been pretty solid for a while, and it's just recently where players are picking up on it. It's very similar to how Darius jungle came into meta. The champ never received any sort of buffs at all, and was always a pretty good jungler, but it just took players a very long time to discover that, especially if you're ranked plat or below right now. Mundo jungle really excels in the lower ranks, so you should highly consider picking him up, as we're adding him to the jungle S tier. Yorick jungle will be an interesting one to track for this patch, because with his early to mid game getting stronger, it will allow for his skirmishing around grubs and dragons to be more competitive. With so many different changes, it's impossible to pinpoint just how much Yorick's power will shift, so we'll leave him in B tier for now, and we'll definitely adjust for mid patch if the changes do land impactful. We've got a ton of changes on the way for Xerath this patch, as every single ability is getting adjusted. Q is flat out buffed, with its AP ratio being increased from 85 to 90%. So looking at the comparison clips, this leads to a 4 damage increase on Luden's completion. W is adjusted so that the base damage is dropping by 10, however the AP ratio is up by 5%. So we can see from the comparison clips that it's a 5 damage nerf on your Luden's completion. So if you were to poke with W and Q, you'd only be down by a whopping 1 damage on your Luden's completion. We can then easily assume that 2 items onwards, that this is a net buff for Xerath due to the AP ratios going up. E base damage is straight nerfed, dropping by 10 at all ranks. And then for R, the base damage is going down by 10. However, the AP ratio is being increased by 5%. So what can we expect from these nerfs? Well, it's pretty likely that support Xerath loses loses power, while mid lane either stays neutral or gains a bit of power. Base damage dropping is bad for support Xerath because he doesn't have the same kind of resources as mid lane does to acquire enough AP to where the AP ratio buffs outweigh the base damage nerfs. Early game in general will be weaker because the base damage nerfs will outweigh the AP ratio buffs. 2 items onwards though is when you will definitely be stronger, and for solo queue specifically, we're leaning more towards this being net positive for Xerath mid lane. With all this in mind, we can't see the changes being enough to warrant a move into the OP tier for Xerath, so we'll be leaving him an S for 25.7. Yuntal Yone could very well be on the menu moving forward, as his passive crit modifier is being changed from 90 to 100%. This means Yone gains full value from critting now, which will make going for a 2-item crit core more valuable. In the past patch, we had actually been seeing Yuntal sitting at a higher win rate than Blade of the Ruined King, so these buffs will skew things even more in favor of Yuntal. As we can see in the comparison clips here, it's an 18 damage difference per crit, so definitely quite significant throughout the course of an extended fight. Now, there is a nerf being issued to compensate though, as Yone E will no longer cleanse crowd control at the end of the spell. Over a large enough sample size, the passive buff will heavily outweigh the E nerf, so Yone is definitely getting stronger for 25.7. E change will only affect you in select matchups and games, where the passive buff will help you in every single game. As a result of the passive buff, we're going to be moving Yone up the tier list, going from B into A tier. So with very minimal mid lane changes for 25.7, we've got the mid lane tier list aligned very similar to where we had it for last patch, with Ahri, Syndra, and Naafiri as the 3 OP tier mids. Ahri gets even better for this patch because her new meta build has her rushing Rod of Ages, so she gets to take advantage of the catalyst buffs. We'll have a more detailed breakdown of this setup in our OP builds video for this week, but definitely take advantage of it while you can, as it consists of rushing Rod, going Liandry's second, and Riftmaker third. Anivia has always been a very high win rate mid in solo queue, so with her also benefiting from the catalyst buff, it could really push her over the top, and we may have to give Anivia a bump into OP tier for mid patch depending on how impactful that catalyst buff lands. It's a complete 180 for the ADC role, as we went from the biggest patch for ADCs that we had seen all season long in 25.6 to now the least impactful patch for the role, as there are no ADCs directly changed for 25.7. As a result, there's nothing that needs to be altered on the tier list for this patch, as we have Vayne, Tristana, and Jinx locking down the OP tier spots. There is one thing worth noting for the ADC role though, and that's how Yasuo has seen a pretty big spike in power as of late. The direct buffs that Yasuo got a few patches ago, coupled with Yuntal Wild Arrows being stronger on melee champs, have been the driving factors to Yasuo's rise. Yuumi being back in meta is a big reason as well, as that duo literally had a 59% win rate in over 3,000 games during 25.6. So it's definitely more of a niche pick, but especially if you're someone who plays Yasuo mid, you should highly consider queuing bot secondary and running him bot lane as well right now. Bot lane in general will be seeing very few changes for this patch, as for the support role, it's just Lulu as the only one getting nerfed. Lulu's Q minimum damage is being lowered by 10 at all ranks, while Q max damage is down by 15 at all ranks. W cooldown won't be scaling into the mid game anymore, as it's being increased from 18 scaling to 16 seconds to 18 seconds at all ranks. So these nerfs should finally lead to priority dropping on Lulu for 25.7, as she had been the highest played support in the game during 25.6. How much power she loses is up in the air, but we're expecting somewhere between a 1 to 2% drop in win rate, which would still leave her in a pretty good spot. So we're only going to be moving Lulu down 1 tier for this patch, going from S into A tier. So with Lulu getting hit with those nerfs, it's really going to allow Nami to take over as that highest priority enchanter. Especially considering Lucian just got buffed last patch and is seeing more play now, there's even more incentive to have Nami in your champion pool, as that duo works incredibly well together. We don't have him added to the support tier list yet, and may not end up adding him at all, but Trundle support is a champ to keep an eye on for this patch. Trundle's E is what's getting buffed, and that's the spell you max out first on Trundle support, so there's a slight chance we could see the champ make a comeback in the role for 25.7. And then with Umbral Glaive gaining power for this patch, Pyke should be back in a good spot. Pyke's win rate had tapered off a considerable amount for this season, and he's been around that B and A tier level, but with the Umbral buff coming through, A tier is where he'll land for 25.7. And then despite Eclipse and Sundered Sky being the higher win rate rush items on Pantheon support, Umbral Glaive has been the most popular rush on the champ in recent patches, so for the average Pantheon player who doesn't really pay attention to meta builds, he's going to become stronger. Umbral should now be much closer in power to Eclipse and Sundered Sky anyways, so it may just be the most optimal rush moving forward. So we're gonna bump Pantheon up 1 tier for this patch, moving him from B into A tier. Alright guys, one last thing, our rank up guarantee is insane. It's like signing up for the gym and getting a refund if you don't get ripped. That's how confident we are in SkillCapped. We obsess over making the best guides with top players, rigorous testing, and top tier video editing to make your climb easy. If you're ready to level up, visit SkillCapped.com and see the difference. So there you have it everyone, that's how we have the tier list aligned as we head into patch 25.7. Thank you all so much for watching, we'll see you back soon.